Another gust of wind caught the elm tree at the end of the alley, twisting and jerking it around like a dog with a rat in its teeth. The few greenish-brown leaves still clinging to the tree branches were instantly ripped off and swept along the wet houses like dirty confetti. Czeslaw heard a loud crack above his head. Not bothering to pick his steps, he crossed the lawn between the bus stop and the parking lot in a few desperate jumps. He barely made it. The trunk of an old elm broke, and the top third of the tree tumbled downward, breaking branches of other trees and snapping the streetlight wires. The latter, however, was no big deal, since there had been no power in the city's grid for a long time. The elm hit the sidewalk with its split end, then crashed across the street, blocking the roadway. Czeslaw wiped his forehead, suspecting that not all the cold drops on his face were of atmospheric origin. In the 2 weeks that the storm had lasted, he, like most of the city's inhabitants, had already been in many unpleasant situations. But this was the first time death had passed so close beside him. He looked at the collapsed trunk of an elm tree, at least 1.5 feet thick. It was a good thing he'd convinced Alma to stay home today. An army armored personnel carrier appeared from around the corner, turned into the parking lot, and slowly approached Czeslaw. The noise of the engine, which before would probably have seemed inappropriately loud in a quiet suburb neighborhood, now barely broke through the howling of the wind and the groaning of trees battered by the storm. Several soldiers, tightly packed in raincoats, jumped down, removed a steel cable from special hooks, and began to fasten it to the fallen trunk, wrapping it around the thickest limbs. An officer peeked out of the tower and looked at Czeslaw. "Are you all right, sir?" he shouted. Czeslaw waved his hand at him. "Yes," he shouted back. "I managed to jump away. Lucky." The officer nodded and looked at the soldiers. They had finished attaching the rope to the fallen elm tree and were now dragging the free end with the giant carbine to the APC. The officer turned to Czeslaw again. "Do you live in this condo?" he shouted. "Yes." "What floor?" "Second." A gust of wind threw a handful of wet leaves in the officer's face. He cursed inaudibly and wiped his face with a waterproof gloved hand. "I advise you to board up the windows if you haven't already done so," he shouted to Czeslaw. "Several people were seriously injured today when the windows burst." "I will." Czeslaw nodded, though he had boarded up the windows with pieces of the back of a bookcase last week. He didn't feel like explaining that to the officer through the howling of the wind. The officer nodded in response. The soldiers had already snapped their carbines into the brace on the APC's hull and stepped aside while the wind was trying to tear their raincoats away. The officer leaned into the hatch and gave some commands to the driver. The engine roared, blasting over the howling of the increasing wind, and the APC jerked, pulling on the cable. Spewing clouds of blue smoke, instantly carried away by the wind, the vehicle dragged the splintered elm tree for about 30 feet. Clearing the roadway and scarring, like a giant gnarled plow, the flooded lawn on which Czeslaw had recently run. The soldiers immediately began to unhook the rope, and the officer once again turned to Czeslaw and shouted something. But realizing that he could not be heard, he shook his head and hustled into the hatch. From there, he emerged with a loudspeaker. "Be advised not to leave the house for the next few days," he shouted into the loudspeaker. "The weather forecast suggests that the wind may increase sharply." Czeslaw nodded, watching the soldiers collecting and fastening the steel rope and climbing back onto the APC. When the vehicle, roaring, slowly drove on, Czeslaw turned around and, shuddering from the gusts of wind and the whips of rain hitting his face, wandered to the front door. After the stormy madness of the street, the room, with its sharp shadows flickering across the walls in the light of the kerosene lamp, seemed the epitome of coziness. Alma was sitting in an armchair by a low coffee table and was warming a pot on the spirit stove, from which the aroma of canned meat, bay leaf, and garlic wafted. Nearby, on a piece of plywood, stood another pot in which boiled potatoes were smoking. "You're just in time," Alma said, brushing a strand of blonde, greasy hair from her eyes. Czesław hung his raincoat on a hook hammered into the wall and set the large gym bag on the floor next to the coffee table. Squatting down, he unzipped the bag and began pulling out cans and vacuum packs of freeze-dried foods and placing them on the table. Meanwhile, Alma had put the food on plates. "Eat first. We'll sort it out later," she said, pulling an old office chair with a tattered upholstery back to the table. "I have a surprise for you," said Czesław, winking without taking his hand out of the bag. "You'll never guess what I've managed to get." He simultaneously raised 2 bottles of beer to the ceiling with a triumphant look. "How's that feel, huh? I traded them for cigarettes at the black market in those abandoned workshops near the railway station." "You're crazy. Why did you go there? It's so far away. What if something happened?" said Alma, but could not hold back a smile. Czesław uncorked the bottles. "Well, as you can see, nothing happened." Czesław sipped from the bottle, took a fork, and started eating. Even though potatoes and canned meat had been the central part of their diet for the last 2 weeks, he ate with great appetite. As they say, hunger is the best seasoning. "A large convoy arrived at the central point today," said Czesław a few minutes later, when his plate was empty. "From what I understand, they came from the southern warehouses. You know, those big underground vaults, some kind of strategic reserves. As usual, they weren't too talkative, but from what I overheard, it was clear that the city is completely cut off. The flood swept all the bridges away, and the strong current made crossing impossible." Alma nodded. "Yes, I'm aware of that. There was a broadcast today. The emergency council representative said there was no reason to panic, that there is enough food and medicine in the warehouses for at least a few months, and that according to all estimates, the wind should start to die in 15 to 20 days at the latest. All the usual gibberish. They could have rewritten the speech template at least a bit. I've already memorized this nonsense to the last word." Czesław leaned back in his chair. The unkept and partially looted apartment seemed incredibly cozy after the hike for supplies, which turned into a non-stop 2-hour struggle with the fierce wind. They had moved into this house with the other refugees 3 weeks ago when their home was swallowed up by the overflowing river. Most of the refugees had then scattered throughout the city in search of more comfortable housing. Czesław and Alma stayed behind. The house was large, and it was impossible to tell for sure, but it looked like they were the last inhabitants of the condo. "Trees have been falling a lot," Czesław said. "Just a few minutes ago, the elm tree on the corner fell. I thought I heard a crack, but it wasn't clear through all that wind howling." Alma finished her bottle and set it on the floor. "I hope you were far enough away. I get so worried every time you leave. Can't we make do with the stuff they deliver home?" "I was at the other end of the alley," Czesław lied, without blinking an eye. "I think that we should use every opportunity to stock up. What if the wind gets so strong that the truck can't reach us? Who knows how long we'll have to survive on what we have?" A powerful gust of wind hit the window, as if to confirm his words. From the sound of it, it tore the last shards of glass that were still there out of the frame. The remnants spilled downward, scratching the plywood sheet with which Czesław had nailed the frame and drumming on the tin of the spillway. In a normal situation, Czesław would have rushed to the window to check whether the pieces of glass had not hit some random passerby, but now he did not even raise an eyebrow. Obviously, there would be no single soul out in the streets in such weather. The radio didn't say anything about other countries. We seem to have all the cities cut off from each other. You didn't hear anything at the distribution center? Czesław shook his head. Nobody knows anything. There are all sorts of rumors, but I think if it were different somewhere else, some information would leak out, and maybe some help came. Alma remained silent. There was no point in repeating the obvious. None of them had believed in any outside help for a long time. By the following day, the wind had picked up even more, changing direction at the same time. Now, the windows of the two-room apartment occupied by Czesław and Alma were entirely on the leeward side, and the gusts of wind stopped violently beating on the window plywood. This made it possible to finally get a decent night's sleep. They didn't have much to do at home. Television had stopped broadcasting 2 weeks ago. Then the city power grid died, and the local radio station was on the air occasionally, mostly with news reports from the emergency council. Trying not to go crazy, Czesław and Alma filled the time with whatever they could. Czesław was working on a big novel, using the old Hemingway system, as Alma joked, with only a pencil and a stack of paper at his disposal. Alma played solitaire and solved chess problems. They had inherited several chess manuals along with the apartment. Sometimes they started to reminisce about the past times, but lately they began to avoid it. The wind roaring outside the house's walls was a too hopeless contrast to the carefree life of the past. On this day, the emergency radio station was not on the air, and there was no delivery of humanitarian aid. Given yesterday's warnings, it was nothing unexpected, but the disruption of what was left of the daily routine was depressing. Czesław took up a pencil, but couldn't make any progress on the new chapter. Finally, he decided to take advantage of the opportunity provided by the change in wind direction and tore off a small plywood patch that covered the hole in the boarded-up window. A large 7-story red brick industrial building was across the street from the house where Czesław and Alma now lived. A few weeks before the wind had picked up, scaffolding had been erected around the building, construction netting had been stretched, and renovation of the facade had begun. But of course, now all works had been shot down. The netting had long since been torn and blown away by the wind, and the building stood in an exoskeleton of aluminum scaffolding, groaning and creaking under the storm's onslaught. Just as Czesław peered through the hole he had made, a corner of the scaffolding, shaken by the powerful gusts, snapped off the fasteners screwed into the wall. Or it could be the bricks that failed, crumbling from the constant vibration in the anchor bolts. The entire openwork structure began to lurch, deflecting away from the wall, until it reached a critical point and collapsed as a shattered pile of pipes and scaffolding. At any other time, the rumbling and scraping would have spread far and wide through the quiet neighborhood. But now the wind blew it all away, and the catastrophe was almost like a silent movie. The wind seemed as if it had been waiting for this. The gusts hit the building with renewed vigor, ripping the remains of the paneling off the crumbling bricks, squeezing the last window frames inside the rooms. Czesław watched this bacchanalia of destruction as if hypnotized. A few minutes later, a powerful gust tore off the edge of the tin roof, and immediately, the whole of it fluttered up in a huge sail, separated from the rafters, and was immediately carried away in a stream of other debris caught by the hurricane. Czesław, stunned, moved away from the window and sat in a chair. When Alma asked him what had happened, he just waved his hand, continuing to stare blankly in front of him. 3 days passed without radio transmissions and humanitarian deliveries, but with a constantly increasing wind. Czesław and Alma realized that they were trapped. It was impossible even to think about going out into the howling inferno of the open space. The wind direction did not change anymore, and they watched in horror as the broken trees fell one after another, as the wind dragged them along the street, knocking and crushing everything they could with their battered trunks. The road signs were long gone. Most of the houses had lost their windows and roofs, and even the old grocery stall near the bus stop had been ripped from its base by the wind and flattened against the wall of the industrial building, where it now lay in an unkempt pile of crumpled tin. They still had enough food, but by unspoken agreement, they had begun to cut back on their daily rations. Completely cut off from the rest of humanity, they became increasingly withdrawn and almost stopped talking to each other, each sinking into personal alienation. Czesław caught himself trying not to meet Alma's gaze and realized that he was doing it to avoid seeing in her eyes a reflection of his own despair and understanding of the hopelessness of the situation. The wind didn't change direction anymore. Czesław spent hours every day watching it destroy the familiar world that once belonged to humans. One day, he saw an armored personnel carrier rolling along the street under the fierce kicks of the hurricane. Perhaps it was the same one commanded by the officer who had advised Czesław not to go out into the street unnecessarily. Now, this advice seemed like a meaningless phrase from an unreal universe. On the 8th day, the wind increased even more, although recently it seemed impossible. The paneled 5-story building, which stood diagonally across the intersection, suddenly shook and folded like a house of cards. The wind immediately began to tear out and toss away everything that he could lift from the huge pile of debris. And it was already a lot. Czesław raised his head and saw the hurricane tearing bricks from the industrial building, starting from the top floor. For a moment, Czesław even thought that he'd seen these bricks disintegrate into dust under the blows of the wind, but he decided that he imagined it. The building was melting before his eyes. The deafening howl and roar did not allow them to talk, so Czesław gestured to Alma, and they both watched for a while as nature destroyed the creation of human hands. Suddenly, Czesław felt the floor shake under his feet. It took him a few moments to realize what it meant. Pierced by a sudden hunch, he rushed to the front door, shouting as hard as he could to Alma to take cover against the inner load-bearing wall. Miraculously, Alma heard and curled up in the corner, covering her head with her hands. With his back against the door, he tried not to think about what would happen to them if the whole house collapsed and buried them under the rubble. The floor beneath his feet trembled more and more. Czesław turned around and put both hands on the shaking door, shouting something unintelligible and reassuring to Alma. He heard and felt the wind disintegrating layer by layer the structures of the house, but he was too afraid to look back, fearful of what he might see, or not see. He was still shouting something he couldn't make out when the elements reached the last shred, where Czesław held his final desperate line, a pathetic wooden door with a meaningless peephole. A moment later, everything was gone, apart from 2 pale spots where his hands were resting on the painted wood, and then they were gone too, leaving only the monstrous noise of the hurricane, which no one else could hear anymore.